All right. I think we can begin then. Cool. Oh, and Jim showed up too. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. My name is Ben Harrington. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Saline. Tonight we're going to be talking about housing supply regulations, specifically in the form of residential density regulations. It's often a very confusing, nuanced, and contentious issue, so I appreciate you all coming out and spending your Wednesday evening with me for hopefully not too long. To go over a schedule, we're going to go over some very brief, important definitions that will help for folks who aren't familiar with how city processes work. Next, we'll dive into what is density in the context of the conversation we're talking about it in. What does density look like, which is why I handed you all that fun activity. Mr. Delorco, I have a copy for you up here as well. Next, what mechanisms, tools, and code does the city currently use to regulate density, and what other regulations exist? Why are density and standards important, and what do they impact? 6 is a proposed code change, and then 7 are common misconceptions, followed by questions and comments, but we'll try to breeze through these as there's not a huge crowd this evening. So to go over some important definitions, we can start with density. It's the relative concentration of people living in an area, but obviously density as a definition applies more broadly. You can talk about the density of chemicals or liquids in a container, but as we're talking about in the social sciences, it usually has to do with people in an area. It can be measured by a city, by a region, by a state, by a country, or even by a single parcel. Which brings us to our next thing, which is units per acre, which is the number of housing units, usually apartment or condo, although you can measure single-family homes as well, divided by the total acreage of the property. It's a common way to calculate density, and because it's a way to calculate density, it's a very common way to regulate density as a result. Next up are zoning districts. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the city essentially assigns various parcels a zoning district, and I have the zoning map for the city right here in front of us. And essentially it controls the use, so whether something can be a single-family home or an automotive shop or a fast food restaurant or a hair salon. It also controls the arrangement of the site, how far things have to be set back from property lines, how tall buildings can be, and then general aesthetics such as landscaping, et cetera, have different regulations based on which district you're in. Planned unit development is an important term, too, to consider this evening. It's a common mechanism that allows builders to ask for bulk exceptions from the zoning. So if a developer wants to put patios 5 feet from the property line, but our code says 10, well, for 40 homes, they can apply for a planned unit development and say, well, I would like to be 5 feet from the property line. And there are all sorts of reasons people choose the planned unit development. One of them is historically and usually density. Next up, we have R3A and R3, which are Saline's multifamily zoning districts. And then lastly, the site plan application. And this is rather important because there's constant hyperbole over, well, if we change standards, well, the city loses control. But for all non-standalone single-family homes, you have to submit a plan to the Planning Commission that outlines the intended look, placement, environmental impacts, signage, parking, et cetera. And the city has a large amount of discretion requiring changes to these if there are valid concerns. So for example, if there's parking on a corner by an intersection, the city could ask the parking be removed or put behind the building as to not block traffic views. If there are concerns over parking in general, you could request more or less parking or impervious surfaces. For stormwater concerns, you could say you need to cut down the amount of surface that you've paved for this street. So the city has a lot of discretion and authority to request changes based on sites as a result of that. So what is density? And the first and foremost thing is that it's comparative and relative. What density means to me is likely not what it means to you or not means to the person sitting next to you. Even if you've been a married couple for quite some time, you might have different understandings of what density is. So on here, I put 3 different developments in Saline: Risdon Heights on the left, Rentschler Farm in the middle, and Thorncrest. Well, for people who live in that middle property historically or in the surrounding townships, density might mean living a mile away from your nearest neighbor. That's the density that they're comfortable with, and coming to a development like Risdon Heights or maybe more of our historic homes in Saline, that's a lot of density to them. But similarly, if we go to New York City or Ann Arbor or Detroit or Chicago, that's obviously another level of density than what we have here. So density is very relative depending on who you talk to, what is high density, what is low density. But for the sake of our talks today, density is fundamentally the proportion of people and homes to a given piece of land, and usually we're talking about a privately owned parcel that could be anywhere from 1 acre to less than an acre to 100 acres. So this is when we're going to start talking about what does density actually look like. So I'm going to pull up 2 examples, and I want you to raise your hand if you think that Risdon Heights on the left side of the screen is more dense than Maple Village, which is a condo development also in the city of Saline. So with a show of hands, just by looking at these 2 photographs, or 4 photographs, I should say, who thinks that Risdon Heights is more dense than Maple Village? Who thinks then, conversely, that Maple Village is more dense than Risdon Heights? So that's correct. Maple Village is about twice as dense as Risdon Heights. There are various aesthetic changes that were made in these too, about the number of paved surfaces, the sizes of garages, etc. So this is the activity I passed out. So on your little piece of paper, I want you to consider each of these and then really quickly, within the next minute, rank them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or sorry, E, F. Which ones you think are the most dense and the least dense, and then we'll talk about it right after. I have pens on the counter up here, and I also have a sheet if you need one.
There's more pens in that drawer there as well.
I showed an aerial of Thorncrest as well, but this is what it looks like. So Thorncrest is the far one on the right here. It's on Clark Street in Saline. And then there's another screen on the TV over there too, if that helps for clarity. I don't know why this one's not cooperating. Is everyone just about done? Awesome. So quick show of hands. Who thought that, I'll just have you raise your hand if you think it was the most dense property. Who thought that A was the most dense? How about B? C? D? E? And then F. Okay. Sal was actually the only one that was right in the room. That property is at Hoover and Green in Ann Arbor. It's about 103 units per acre. The second one on there is 68 units over 1 acre in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I actually was just staying there, which is why I included it as an example. 3 is a property in Boise, Idaho, and 3 and 5 actually have very similar commonalities here. They're both on less than an acre, so neither of them actually have as many units per acre as they are, but that's one of the fundamental issues with density regulations or units per acre regulations is they don't necessarily count for how many people are actually living at that property, but rather the property in proportion to the land. So 3 is actually affordable senior housing in Boise, Idaho. 5 is where my fiance lives in Ann Arbor. 6 units over less than 1/6 of an acre, or just over 1/6 of an acre, which if you do the math in your head is about 34. Number 4 is in Ann Arbor. It's on Packard Street. It's called the George. It's a brand new building. Size speaking, it's the biggest property on this list with having over 300 units. And then lastly, Thorncrest right here in Saline is 21 units per acre. So for council members, this might be an advantage if you know the ordinance, but which of these do you think that could be built in Saline today? And I'll just go through the list again and raise your hand if you think that it could be built. How about A?
Nope.
B?
Nope.
C?
Yep.
D?
Nope.
E?
Yep.
F?
Yes.
It's actually none of them. It's a trick question. So that ties into how did we get to the point where none of those buildings could be built into Saline? And we have a couple things that regulate density, such as the fire code and the Michigan building code that affect density in both de facto ways, meaning they control the amount of area on a floor that can be dedicated to residential units versus fire stairwells or other things. We also have minimum livable standards. So the fire code and the building code's main purpose is to say that regardless of where you live in the state of Michigan, you're in a place that's safe and habitable. So it's addressing those life safety concerns and those basic minimum comfort standards that we've established as a state. Within the city's control, we limit the units per acre. As we just went over, it was a units per acre calculation. We mandate a partial square footage per additional unit, so we have a set amount of parcel space you need for one unit, and then you have to add square feet for each additional unit. And then lastly, we mandate the dimensions of individual properties. What's important to note is that all of the above on the city side were created with Saline Ordinance 214 in 1969. So those ordinances are about 55 years old, and I have a cut of my finger to prove from a 50-year-old binder that I actually have the ordinance, and it's hanging in my office right now. So these are the actual code languages. So we have the units per acre caps here on the left, as I mentioned, established in 1969, as with the lot area requirements, so the additional space needed for extra units. And then importantly, going back to that PUD conversation we had earlier, a common use for PUDs in other communities is to allow for more density. So you can ask the city as part of consideration to allow for more units on a specific property than you could have with underlying density. Well, in Saline, we actually specifically prohibit that, and there are some limited exceptions to that. But per the code, the total number of dwelling units in a PUD project shall not exceed the number of dwelling units permitted in the underlying zoning district or master plan land use designation. And then this is an example of our lot standards. So as you can see, or maybe not see because it's a very small table, but for residential districts, the minimum size of a lot is 7,800 square feet. So if you're in the R1C district, you can have a 7,800 square foot lot unless you somehow negotiated that or your builder negotiated that through a planned unit development. But these are important too, because if you think about the city as a finite area of land being scarce in the community, which it effectively always will be, even if we expand and go out further, we're determining what size of the pie that people can cut. And not only what can they cut, but what they must cut. So we're demanding that they have 7,800 square foot lots, which works really well for common single family homes, but it struggles to capture more nuances with different types of family needs, different sizes of development, different types of what people are looking for. So if you haven't been able to piece some of it together on your own already, why are density standards important? First and foremost, they affect housing supply, which in turn affects how many people can come to our community because we're limiting the number of units available to folks. Two, it affects options and choices because, as I just mentioned, not every development is viable on a 7,800 square foot lot. Sometimes it's much more viable and economically viable for builders to build on a 4,000 square foot lot or a 3,000 square foot lot and allow more units as a result. And then lastly, over time and over space, density affects affordability. So making sweeping changes to our density regulation today is not necessarily going to bring down the cost of housing tomorrow. But in economics, you learn about short-run and you learn about long-run economies. And in the long-run economies, efforts across the region to add more housing units does at least temper the price of housing, even if it doesn't lower it, so that real wages can catch up and you're less housing cost burden, which is ultimately what economists are really concerned about. So affordability at its finest, but it's not just the effort of Saline in this case, it would be the effort of other people. However, options and choices do matter. A lot of our residents are looking to downsize. So perhaps moving out of my 4,000 square foot home into a 2,000 square foot condo, it might be a more affordable and better option for me, which then frees up a home for a new young family that might be interested in entering our community. So if you haven't also come to these conclusions on your own, why should we be interested in changing our code or at the least evaluating it? And we know that our current regulation, which was made 55 years ago, was in a very different time, a very different place, when the price of construction, the price of labor, and the price of land in Saline were all drastically different. And that's not even before we get to people's outlook on what Saline should be and what is our role in the region, what is our role as a community, and how many people live here. I do have a map, a zoning map from 1968 in my office as well that shows that the city is essentially Forcia in the downtown area and the Mill Pond Park. So it's a very different landscape 55 years ago. So at the very least, it makes sense to reconsider a regulation that's that dated. We also know that housing in Saline has become increasingly unaffordable, especially in the last decade. If you've come to another meeting where I've talked about housing, which many of you in this room have, you've likely heard me cite the fact that housing, the price of a house in Saline last month to purchase was about $475,000. So the average person is spending almost $500,000 or $500,000 to buy in our community, which is definitely affordable for some, but it's really not affordable or attainable for a lot of folks who would like to live here. And then cascading to our next choice here is that housing options and choices in Saline are relatively limited, meaning we have less of that product as a percentage of our stock compared to other communities. So that would be market rate townhomes and condos built in the last century or in the last 20 years. But then we're also absolutely limited in the fact that we don't offer products that other communities do have, such as market rate apartments that have things like a dishwasher or in-unit laundry. None of the apartment buildings in our community have been built recently enough to have those amenities or have modern countertops, et cetera. So there's also a conversation about housing options and choices and how density impacts those. And then lastly, we know that units per acre regulations are a real barrier. And this is not Ben Harrington saying this. This would be the Michigan Association of Planners saying this, at APA, the Association of Planners of America, saying this. I mean, we know that these are a real barrier to development, and they do not take into account what actually makes a property feel more or less dense, which kind of goes back to this example here. There are all sorts of reasons why people chose one property or the other as feeling less dense. Some of it comes down to yard space. Some of it comes down to general aesthetic and the angle at which you're you're looking at the building, where the parking of these buildings is located, et cetera, and the sheer size of them as well, I'll add. So site plans actually do control some of those aesthetic aspects that we'd like to see to make properties blend in and look more like our community, whether that's having single-family home-esque facades like some of those examples did, or scaling down to not be more than 35 feet, which is actually our zoning code. So currently the City Council will be considering a proposed ordinance 848, and this is what it essentially did. It took the R3A district and went from 12 to 15 for one bedrooms, 10 to 12 for two bedrooms, and then 9 to 10 for 3 and 4 bedrooms, all as units per acre. Ordinance 848 is a starting point for the conversation, but in reality we can do a lot more as a community if this is an issue that we're interested in taking up. So other possible changes would be removing the discrimination and the differentiation of the number of bedrooms from R3A to R3 and setting a flat standard. So rather than saying you can only have 15 per acre for one bedrooms and 12 per acre for two bedrooms, we drop that standard and then set a flat rate. And there's all sorts of reasons to do this, especially as people work from home. Having the second bedroom has probably more of a space implication at this point than it does another human being living in the home, especially another human being that can drive in the home, I should add. In addition, allowing builders to ask the city for more density via the PUD process is another tangible thing that we can do. So removing the one line in our code that prohibits even them asking. And now a PUD has to go through the Planning Commission and it has to go through the City Council. So there's two independent bodies of review on that specific process. The next thing would be evaluating our single-family homes to reduce minimum lot sizes and or setbacks of our existing higher density single-family districts. So our R1C, do we really need 20 feet between each property line, or could we as a community allow people to have a little bit more room in their side yard and their rear yard? And this has especially an implication for new builds that have to go through a rather arduous PUD process in order to achieve those things. In addition, that's what the last item here does, is creating an additional R1D district that would be our maximum allowed density. We would decide as a community that 3,000 square foot lots, for example, would do the trick, that would be the minimum allowed density for a home in our community, and that would then spur development and avoid the PUD process and allow more streamlined development to occur without fear of retaliation or that we would reject a PUD for such a premise. So before we get into questions and comments, just to briefly go over some common misconceptions. Would these changes to the zoning code require me to do something with my property? And the answer is not at all. It simply allows people on their own volition or on their own economic means to choose to do something with their property that would be different. But it doesn't require anybody to do anything with their property as it is now. And would these changes allow developers to do whatever they want? And the answer is absolutely not. Going back to that site plan process, there's still other means of reviews, arrangement that we can and will act on as a city, and we currently are with the numerous other projects that are not residentially related. Another common concern with density and renting specifically is, won't people who are taking advantage of this density of this higher project not be from here? And I've actually talked to the folks who developed Westgate and Cascade, and that builder has informed me that their primary clientele are people over 60. In fact, he ballparked that 75% of people who live in those developments are over 65, because it's primarily people looking to downsize. And I know of a few city officials who've also sold their homes in their communities to move to smaller condos because they don't want to manage the whole size of a house. They don't have the family that they used to living with them, so they can do with less living space. So we also have to think about these people being current residents of our community, looking for an easier option, but still to stay with the community that they've known, or even potentially family members of the community looking to be closer to their grandchildren or other folks like that. And then would these changes be safe? Are the fire department and building department capable of handling projects that might be slightly more dense? And the answer is absolutely. They're heavily regulated by both the codes. These are conversations we have. I oversee the building department and I have a good relationship with the fire chief. So these are absolutely things that we're considering. And then I just kind of listed most of the other concerns that folks have, which are traffic, parking, noise, fire, and environmental concerns. But once again, these are all reviewed by a variety of independent bodies. So our code is purely what we choose to value and what we want to see as a community in terms of aesthetics. But most of these issues are almost always covered by another body or covered by another set of regulations that currently exist. So environmental concerns are addressed by the county, by the state, by the planning commission, by the building department. They have energy standards for the types of walls walls. The building department has standards for floors and walls between units and exterior walls that limit the noise that can escape. And then lastly, any concerns really about renters or the noise they might cause or parking concerns are no less enforceable than concerns against the neighbors you already have. If your neighbor's playing loud music at 2 in the morning or illegally parking on the street or not mowing their grass, those are all concerns that we can enforce just as we can now. That the changes in our density standards don't affect our abilities to do that. So with that, I'm sorry for taking so long, and I'll take questions and comments. I do not have a handheld microphone. It's usually on that.
It's right behind you, Ben.
Oh.
Make sure the switch is on at the bottom.
Yeah, the pictures you showed were from communities that were much larger than ours.
Yes, absolutely.
That's right. So that's why they need to have that higher density, because they are bigger. And I will tell you that many 65-year-old people, the cheapest place they can live is in their home that's paid off, not in a new condo. So I just, a lot of the things that you said are good in other places. And I think the one that you said you lived in, I think that's student housing, isn't it?
Which one? The one on Brown Street, or that fiance lives in, or
How about that one on the bottom in the middle?
E? That's where my fiance lives. I don't live there, but yes, it's nearby campus.
Yeah.
Right, but
So that's cheaper, and that's good for students, but it's, 3 levels for an older person to climb up unless you have a ladder, or 4 levels to climb up when you have, don't have an elevator. It's, it's not a good thing for older people.
No, I totally agree. I don't think that option necessarily matches that demographic of the community.
That's right.
But there are other components of our community that would match that demographic.
I don't know, they could do well with a condo, and as far as 20 feet between homes, that's a pretty good thing. My driveway and my neighbor's driveway, because it's the first set of homes that were built in Saline, and they threw in the last one because they could make more money. And so my neighbor and I, we had like this far between our driveways.
Right. I think that
Need for snow.
no, I think that right. I think that speaks exactly to your need as not only a resident of our community, but as a consumer of a housing product, that meets your need. I think that the broader conversation here is our housing stock meeting everybody's need? And I think that's what the consideration is, because no one would require you to live in this building that's here at E. It wouldn't be what our housing stock is reduced to. It's more of a conversation of, is that the type of housing product that aesthetically fits in our community, and is there a demand for it? And I think the answer is yes to both.
I understand that. However, this is not just a Saline problem or an Ann Arbor problem. It's a Frankenmuth problem. It's everywhere.
Right.
It's in Detroit. They're changing things there. They're trying to make affordable, attainable housing for people. But the problem is the cost of a loan, the cost of, lumber, building it. Who are you going to have? Can you trust them to build what they're supposed to say? I don't think we need a 3-level apartment house building in Saline, but we do need some housing. I mean, it's a problem for younger people to be able to even get in the housing market.
And I agree, and I think that's where we're looking at trying to find, are there ways to build smaller homes that would be more accommodating? In some cases, even like when you mentioned taller buildings, Mill Pond Manor, which is a multi-story type facility, that is not necessarily an assisted living type facility, which is more affordable. And I think those are the types of things that could be allowed when we start talking about greater density. It's really achieving those type of affordable type homes to a certain height. But most buildings now, new buildings, are required to have
Standpipes.
required to have water systems or something that puts it out, or there's other issues that related to fire equipment and requirements now that have never were required in the past, but in these type of buildings they are.
It's part of the expense of being there. I don't know. I don't know any,
And,
I just-
and you're right, that is the issue of being able to afford homes, which individuals and making smaller. Right now, most of the demand has been for these larger homes.
And they want marble, and they want a garage, and they want
Right.
all the things that everybody has, and I understand that also. But in our zip code, and I also know a lot of people that live in Ann Arbor, I mean, they pay like $89,000 in taxes because the university doesn't pay any in their city. I mean, it's an expensive area. I don't know how, I don't think building up is really the answer, you know?
So, Ben, we might want to clarify, of those pictures you had up, none of the proposals that we're looking at would consider density that intense.
No, so the proposed ordinance was to go to 15 units per acre, which for the R3A district, we're not even touching the R3 yet. Looking at a units per acre, I really have a hard time seeing Saline go past number 4 even. So we would probably cap it around 40 units per acre, which would still probably make only 5 and 6 viable options out of this. But like as I mentioned, one of the larger considerations with density is, well, and to your point about senior housing, number 3, which is a 3-story building with an elevator, I'm assuming in it, 36 units, is on less than an acre. So the real issue with the units per acre measurement specifically is that it doesn't capture the nuance of having a really small lot, but still able to accommodate all these folks and parking, et cetera. Right, and I think that the parking in our community is especially important. We're much more of a suburb or a rural area. We're not loading up our streets with on-street parking. We're definitely not dropping parking minimums, which is something that Ann Arbor has done, or we're not going to upzone homes either. So,
People would like to know where in Ann Arbor they're changing that, because I think my daughter left the U of M with a $200 bill of parking ticket.
it seems to be recurring. I had plenty in Minneapolis, don't get me wrong.
So, I mean, I understand there is an issue here. I just don't know if building up is such a great idea. Probably gives more money to the city, which I'm sure. I've walked around and talked to a lot of people, and number one, they say it seems like the city doesn't care what they put in there as long as they get the revenue. And then you look at the builder, which my family sold land on Maple Road, which is Pittsfield Township, and this guy bought it and held it. He just he didn't really buy at that time. He messed around, lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And the day they closed on that property is the day he also closed with Pulte. Who's building all these homes that are being attached to our city?
I'm very familiar with Pulte.
Yeah.
Right, so I would say the conversation's a little bit broader than the one site. I think you're referring to 207 Monroe. And I think it's a little...
Thinking it's important, though, to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that necessarily building up is always the right way to look at it, because we still do have firm height caps of 35 feet. So, right, which is a cap on the height of the building, but it's more of how many units can be on here. And I think that's where the confusion is getting, because, number 5 here is a sunken story building. So it's a basement that you walk down into, or you can walk in on the ground floor. So there's 2 different ways to access that building. But even though that's only 2 stories in practicality, it wouldn't be allowed in our community because of that units per acre regulation. So it's not so much height, thinking about, does this regulation make technical and regulatory sense?
If you look at the basement of the property on Monroe, which you've been talking about, that is very low land. I mean, everything drains down there. What is it, the wastewater that's put in there is not for, that they put in that system, it's not for a basement.
No, I totally hear you, and I don't think the intent on that specific site from the 2 proposals that the city council has received is not to do high rises by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even to do apartments anymore. They're going to be single-family condos per the 2 developers.
And I
that have
believe
pitched it.
what Ben is also talked about is that we have to look at every site and its unique characteristics and whatever. There are sites in which you can build and put basements on, but you have to have the proper drainage, you have to have all that things to it. So those are all taken into consideration. Height becomes more of an issue in terms of, do you want to provide more units in a location so that more people can live there? And even in our situation, we have housing stock that is now fast approaching 60 years or older that are multiple units that are allowed, but incentivizing to make sure that those can be rebuilt and redone, the cost of doing that has to be dispersed over the number of units, and there's, the whole model of cost and everything. Are there other questions?
Yeah, Ben, for reference, can you tell us the Risden Heights, was it passed with a PUD?
I believe it was, simply because it's a tight condo, so it's an R2 PUD is what but yes, it's definitely not a PUD. I don't have the specifics in front of me, but I'm
Yeah, that was a PUD. Also was, Layer Farms.
Layer Farms is also a PUD.
Type of PUD.
And
Huntington Woods is also.
Maple Cove and Maple Oaks.
Right. So it's a very common tool utilized by the city, but part of the reason that we have to use PUDs and constantly go case by case by case is because usually that's indicative of the ordinance not matching reality in terms of what developers are capable or builders are capable of building for any sort of economic viability.
And a prime example, Maple Oaks, is an example where we took a lot, allowed for more density, allowed the homes to be closer together, even allowed duplex-type buildings so that we could provide for a more better community, which is the kind of type of housing and things that don't necessarily mean building up, but it means building closer and providing for that.
So Maple Oaks is one example, but there are others. So how does the units per acre work when you have space where there's green space set aside?
Right, so there's a provision in the PUD ordinance that if you leave about 40% of your purchase parcel vacant, that then you can get up to a 25% density bonus. But it's very rigid language, and that's also implying that the density bonus itself, that our original density standard they're getting a bonus from, was already adequate, or that 25% of 12 units per acre, which is 15 essentially units per acre, would still be adequate to achieve that development. And that does not appear to be the case with a lot of these things.
So the space that's the green space doesn't...
It does count when you're doing the initial calculation, yes.
Okay.
So the city's done, I think, 4 master plans since this ordinance came into effect in the 60s.
More than that.
Yeah, I would say at least 4. And given the importance of housing and housing density and those considerations for all of the aspects of the city, whether it is mobility, wastewater treatment, all the other things, why or what has the consideration been in the master plans up to now that nothing has changed in 50 years?
They've been very limited. From the master plans I have read, there's been very little conversation over the general density of the city.
Okay, so as we look at this going forward, one of the issues around the city that's been discussed ad nauseum is the wastewater treatment challenges and the fact that we are at or over capacity. Depending on the day and the smell, you can determine how far over capacity we are. And increasing housing density, which is likely to go up faster than we are addressing the wastewater treatment issue, does it make sense to address this once we have the plan actually in process for wastewater treatment, as opposed to raising it now and hope that the wastewater treatment plan comes together?
Yeah, absolutely. So our city manager is also very capable of speaking at that as she's...
Hold on, folks. One at a time.
Certainly. So speaking specifically to the issue of utility capacity within the city, it's entirely dependent on the location of that new development and the density, whether any additional infrastructure is needed. There are plenty of infill opportunities within the city where you could essentially plug and play into our existing utility systems. We also have some utility system upgrades plans, such as the East Belt project on the east side of town, and next year the West Belt project on the west side of town. But as far as capacity goes, we have ample room for growth on the residential side. The city is actually pretty evenly split in terms of our utility users. About 50% is residential, about 50% is commercial or industrial users. So when you think about the capacity on our system, it's actually large industrial users that are more likely to have a greater impact than, say, 40 or 50 single-family homes.
But all the crap goes to one place, and it's not being managed. I don't care whether it's commercial crap or residential crap. The city stinks. So we have an infrastructure problem.
Absolutely, and the city has a very comprehensive plan for how to address that. We have the funding source from the state that's been secured. We have design plans. I literally just received the 60% design plans today. That project is moving forward. I expect that we'll be bidding on it this fall, or this spring, actually, May, selecting the contractor by July and starting progress in the fall. As for the smell, the odor that residents experienced over this weekend, that was related to a specific issue with our digester unit. There's a flare attached to it that helps to burn off those excess odors. We've since had crews look at it, and we have manufacturers coming out to reset that unit so they don't experience that problem again.
And maybe just to clarify that too, that there's more of a component issue with the specific machinery itself and whether it's properly functioning rather than does the plant itself in its totality have capacity. So regardless if you add the 50 units, the effect is the same.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sal Randazzo. Forgive me, I had to step away. You may have answered this question. I'd like to know where the pressure on city government to increase the densities is coming from. Is it coming from developers that want to develop and they're not able to because of the way the zoning is now? Because it certainly isn't coming from the citizenry. And so I don't understand where the pressure is coming from to change the codes to allow for greater density.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely multifaceted. So I think you'd be surprised to know that a lot of residents are very concerned about the cost of housing, and whether or not they directly associate that with density is another question. But the cost of housing and what the city is capable of doing to reduce the cost of housing definitely is one of the genesises of this conversation and why we're all here tonight. Another consideration is our workforce. People who man our stores, who wait on us at restaurants, who serve us at our favorite establishments, people who work at Forcia at 2 in the morning, people who work at American Soy or Flat Out. These are people who make decent money. They're making $60,000 a year plus, but they themselves are incapable and unable to live in the city. And in fact, many of our employers come to us and say, how are we going to improve transit to the city? How are you going to improve housing in the city? Because we have to continually look for workers for Belleville. And a real concern is that our employers, whether it be Forcia or American Soy or Flat Out, who have these light industrial buildings, might find a better light industrial building in Lenawee. And then we're not only losing an employer, we're losing assets, we're losing people who would otherwise have lived in our community, and the city is in fact losing tax base as a result, which then reverts back to the resident and once again raises the cost of housing for the community. So those are multifaceted things. Now, as for the practicality of what our actual regulations are too, yes, of course, when people are talking about building, we have to take into consideration, well, what do we continue to hear is feasible or not feasible for them, and how does that actually work with our regulations? So we're attempting to also be a responsive government and responding to citizen complaints, business complaints, developer complaints, because we're responsible for all of them. We're trying to field all of them.
So the law of unintended consequences would be people that have bought in Saline have aspired to live in a community like Saline with small town values, have seen appreciation of their homes because of the limited amount of home stock in Saline. So are you saying that you're going to try to dilute the value that we have in our properties now by adding more property, and by that diluting the value of our property?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I think that the government arbitrarily keeping people out of the community by setting rather rigid density standards and by mandating that a property must be this large in order to live on it is actually doing exactly what you're insinuating that this ordinance would do. It's artificially raising the cost of housing and requiring people to purchase at a much higher rate than they otherwise would need to. And once again, I would go back to that. The building more supply does not devalue housing. There's very little empirical evidence to cite that. And in fact, actually, developing nearby homes raises home values because it indicates that the area is more in high demand. So it actually raises home values to an extent too. Now, over a region, as I mentioned, I guess you were maybe absent for that part, but over a region, over a period of time, building supply of housing up lowers the cost and lowers the temperature across the entire region. So it's not just Saline's effort. It would have to be Chelsea, Dexter, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti Township, Pittsfield, Milan, et cetera. It's a team effort on that front to temper the cost of rising housing.
You know, 2 years ago, I came to a meeting here and I asked the city about the sewer that, can we have have 150 more homes hooked up to the sewer? And you said, oh, yes, oh, yes. Well, now our water and the sewer we are paying for quite dearly with our water. I mean, I live alone. My last water bill was $190, which is something you might think about when you have all these homes that people are coming in and maybe they can afford it, but then there's the utilities and then there's the taxes and all the other things. And when you say, and by the way, I've lived by the sewers for 30-some years, and it has stunk for 30. And it's not a new problem that we've had. We've just ignored it. I'm sorry. We've ignored it. We've put Band-Aids on it, but it needed work for a long time. The other thing is how, so are you saying then, say you choose the Monroe property, more than 21 condos in there, we're going to squish them together and have more? Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. Actually, I have no control over who the city chooses to sell the Monroe property to. It's actually the people directly adjacent to you. So,
yeah, it's exactly right.
Right.
I want to know what you're thinking about putting there.
So
currently under our existing zoning for that lot, what would be the number of units allowed?
So on a single family, if they were to build only one bedrooms, and they would have to still propose this to the city, so they could build 48 one-bedroom apartments on that site, they could build 40 two-bedrooms on that site, and then they could build 36 three-bedroom pluses on that site. But once again, the city has the total discretion to sell that lot and establish any additional conditions. I know that because it's next to a historic neighborhood, because it's nearby the cemetery, et cetera, the city could add additional conditions for that specific lot, for sure. So that's totally, like I said, it's kind of outside the scope of necessarily this specific conversation because the city has an unprecedented level of control on that specific site.
Well, and let me add, too. So the City Council entertained one proposal at their last meeting a week ago. We will entertain a separate proposal from another developer at our subsequent meeting, which is on the 27th, and you're welcome to attend that. It's at 7 p.m. I suspect that at one of our next meetings, either the first meeting in March or the second meeting in March, we will develop consensus on how best to proceed with the development and potential sale of that property. Now, there are multiple steps that will need to be taken and performed before any development can commence on that site. So we would need to finalize a sales agreement, which would have a number of stipulations and conditions. They would need to close on the property, of course, and then it would need to go through the planning and zoning process and get both preliminary and final site plan approval by City Council or by the Planning Commission.
I'd just like to respond to the first part of your question as well, because this is a very common misconception in the community that somehow more houses coming into the community is detrimental to our utility systems. It is a huge benefit for the community if we can add more users to the system. If you think of the cost of that wastewater treatment plant rehabilitation as a pie, the more people we have to share that pie, the lower that burden is going to be on the individual residents.
And the individual people who buy that place, they're going, I mean, it's going to be costly for them to pay for utilities.
Certainly. Right now, we are trending very high on our sewer costs, though our water utility cost is pretty normal for the region. But sewer costs, we are continuing. I will be lobbying later in March directly to our federal senators and state Congresswoman Dingell. We are lobbying directly with our state representatives to ask for funding so that we don't become the most expensive sewer service in the state.
And then I can add, too, that although affordability is absolutely a byproduct of density in some senses, it's not the only intent. Like I mentioned earlier, some of it's just options and choices for different people to choose a home that best fits their needs. So downsizing to a 1,000-square-foot home from a 4,000-square-foot home, things like that. So affordability, although it is a concern, and I understand the concern of our utility rates, I do think that it's a little bit more multifaceted than that, and it's not just the affordability that we're considering here. It's really options and choices and then supply to allow more people to come, essentially.
And one of the things that, as we talk about density and the issues of over the last 40 years, this community has not had a demand for a type of housing of that type of nature. They've been wanting single-family homes And that's what we've been meeting the demand. The demand is now changing. No one saw 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, the impact of what the pandemic and some of these other things have done in terms of us having to try and meet the needs now of people working from home or actually even living in a smaller unit in order to afford it. So the thing is, you can only project as well as you know of the information at that time, and this community did that. We never projected to grow like in Ann Arbor. That was never a plan of the idea. But there has been issues in terms of we've made plans for the build-out of our community in terms of open area and whatever, and to take on some areas of the city. But for us to expand even further, that's a whole nother measure of planning, and that'll be something that's going to be taken care of.
Absolutely, and I can add to that too. We're by no means trying to become anywhere near like Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor doesn't even have density caps in their downtown. We're not trying to build over 35 feet, but even places like Dexter has taken 30 and 40 unit per acre projects that work well in their community. They were chosen, they were placed well, and as a city, for any greenfield or any annexation or any infill developments, we have the first right to zone it however we want to zone it. And in fact, we could even create a PUD before passing it off to somebody so that they have to comply with a specific set of regulations. So we have a lot of autonomy and control. It's more a matter, is this unit per acre regulation framework we have really the best option for the community, or are there other ways to achieve what we're trying to achieve by allowing more options for folks?
You made it very clear earlier that parking minimums were not a part of this discussion and weren't going to be touched.
Not at all.
Why?
Well, I think that parking is in of itself an additionally contentious and nuanced and confusing issue. So I'm trying to separate the two slightly here, and there's no reasonably expected change to our parking minimums. I would not propose that at the moment. I think our parking for apartments is actually pretty fair. So it's 1 per unit, and then for every 5 units you need to have an addition, or sorry, it's 1 per bedroom, and then for every 5 units you need to have an additional spot for guest parking.
And as people work from home and the other things, the changes that are happening, there isn't the same need for parking as there has been historically. And looking at housing and mobility as two separate issues is a classic mistake that
Correct.
is, I'm sure you covered in school, that housing and transportation go hand in hand.
Right, and I see parking and transportation in slightly different contexts. But for example, of a parking ordinance I would love to change overnight would be we have a 1 per 100 square foot parking requirement for shopping centers, which is why if you look at the Bushes Plaza or even the plaza that the Goodwill is in on the west side of town, we're way overparked as a community. Even in our downtown, we know that we're achieving like 54% occupancy of our parking rates at peak hours on a Friday and a Saturday. So I am cognizant of the fact that we're overparked, but I think specifically for the housing conversation, it can be quite an adjustment for the community to get used to the fact that maybe we're okay with people living a little closer together, and you're not trying to throw the parking on them at the same time. And even still, I think our parking requirements for multifamily specifically are actually far more in line with best practices than, let's say, our parking for shopping centers. So there's a little bit of a nuance to that specifically. But I think transit, to your point, is definitely something the city is also actively considering as part of our master plan process too. How are we going to make it easier for people to come to our city for sharing the same workforce concerns I shared a minute ago?
I personally, as a 35-year resident of Saline, I have a problem with the argument that adding more housing and more people is going to share the burden and lower the cost to the residents, because you look around and you see how much has been built in the last 10 years in the way of condos and homes, and I haven't benefited from the cost sharing at all. So, I mean, there's a lot of times you get up and speak on the what may come, but it doesn't come. And so there's a tendency when you're trying to sell a project to talk about the what may come, but I mean, my experience of 10 years has showed me that it's just not true, or it hasn't been true.
In the grand scheme of things, it's actually interesting you brought up that point. So it's from 1960 to now, the city population has doubled. It's gone from 4,000 to, or 4,500 to about 9,000, nearing 10,000. In the last 10 years, the city's population has grown by about 500 people. So I think there's constant conversation about we've had a lot of growth, but in reality, a lot of the growth that the city had was achieved 30 or 40 years ago. So most of the growth we've seen in the last 10 years is really happening in the last 3 years. So I think we're still seeing projects like Lair Farms, which which is on Maple, like Huntington Woods that recently wrapped up this summer, like Maple Oaks, which has also been wrapping up this summer. These are projects that are just now coming online. So I think in a handful of months, you might actually see that change, but it's absolutely something I'm glad to talk about more with you.
Yeah, you're correct. The Great Recession stopped a lot of development that was going to happen in town. In fact, stopped a 1,000-home potential growth outside the city. Would have happened in Saline Township. But one of the things that we benefited in the last year is that the desirability of Saline is reflected in the housing prices, and unfortunately, that's now reflected in the aspect of people being able to attain housing in the city. So current homeowners have benefited from the increase in their property value, but those that want to move into the city may not be able to afford it. And that's the disparity. And then if you want to try and downsize or change, your opportunities aren't there. And we have to, that's a whole big picture, and this is what Ben's trying to talk about, is that we need to look at this, because if you want to be able to stay within your own community, what are your options when you want to either upsize or downsize? And we don't necessarily have enough options to do that.
And I'd also add that I think the development of the city is far more inelastic now than it was in 2009. And what I mean by that is, it's less likely to prone to change. So elasticity is this concept that, if you have something that's malleable, you can move the price of it rather easily. So like oranges in the winter, if the harvest is poor, it's rather elastic, so the price will go down. If the harvest is great, there's more oranges, the prices go down versus more. But with housing, for example, it's rather inelastic. It always has some sort of fixed cost. It's always going to cost quite a bit. Now, for our economy as a whole, where do our people work? Who are they working for? How does that end up affecting our economy in the sense of a recession? Well, even 10 years ago, we had far more people working in more traditional manufacturing jobs, which have a higher amount of elasticity because it's tied to consumer spending. So if there's a recession, people are spending less, they're not getting work, they're not making stuff at work, they lose their jobs, or they get a wage deduction. Now, the University of Michigan and universities have a high amount of inelasticity compared to recessions, because students still go to school when there's a recession. And in fact, more students go to school when there's a recession because they can't find a job. So our economy is far more tethered now to a more stable institution than previously, where it was more manufactured and consumer spending based. And this is a transition that most of Washtenaw County is going through, and it has real consequences for development outlooks that might be more optimistic now than they were even 10 years ago.
Go to school from out of this country to view them. And they're going to school for a specific thing, and then they leave.
Right.
Not because they can't find housing, because their families are displaced.
Is there any other question? We got a couple more minutes.
But it's the folks
Linda?
working for the institution, if that makes sense, or working for... 6.
Oh, I knew it's 7 on 9.
Can you give me an estimate of what it takes for a contractor to get a project through without a PUD and with a PUD? So what are they going to lose because they have to go through an exception?
So with the PUD process, it's more carefully negotiated or worked on with the developers, because you're talking about specific setbacks. So I would review it, our consultant planner would review it, they would both provide commentary. It goes back, they have to go to the planning commission with it. The PUD process is in and of itself more expensive because of this additional layer of review. And then with the PUD process too, the city has more discretion. So for a site plan, you usually have to tie it back to a specific planning related reason for why that parking needs to be moved. Or you could say, well, you need a traffic study for this specific project, but you can't outright ban it, or you risk litigation by denying something if you don't have a concrete and fundamental reason or a serious concern, essentially. With the PUD, the city has far more discretion to say yes or no to whatever they want because you're asking for that exception. So there's a little bit more leeway and a little bit more risk to a developer seeking a PUD, because the process is not quite as straightforward. It's not quite as fair and consistent as a site plan process is.
Well, I would submit that that's a cost for the...
Yes, right. It deters development in a sense, yes. And I think PUDs are becoming more ubiquitous because communities like ours established these really robust zoning codes 50 years ago, but then we've had generations of people who enforce those zoning codes and do a fantastic job at it, but they're not necessarily critically evaluating whether this code makes sense for the community given the current landscape, whether that code was ever written correctly. So units per acre have been widely dismissed by other communities because they don't see it as necessarily indicative of capping development the way they need to in their community.
So I have a question about infill. I have personal bias toward the idea. So does the city have any idea what potential there is for additional infill development in the city? Like what, or
Right, so development potential is kind of a hard thing to track because sometimes it's just, do you know the person who owns the property? Do they know that you're a developer or a builder? And would they be willing to sell it to you? But there are a couple metrics that you can use, such as like owner occupation for businesses specifically. If a business owns their site, they're more likely to hold on to it because they don't see it as an investment versus like a Blackstone or one of these large conglomerates that owns investment property who's more likely to sell it. So for commercial property, there's a little bit easier of a metric. But for homes, it's really coming down to, is this neighborhood of individual, a row of individual home buyers or homeowners really interested in selling to somebody else? So no, there's not really a clear metric to necessarily predict where infill development is coming up, but we do try to keep our ear to the ground and try to be cognizant of things that may or may not be occurring in the city.
Linda, real quick, I can cite a few specific parcels, and maybe the city manager can as well, because she and I have talked about this recently. I think there's 1 or 2 outstanding lots in our industrial parks that could be developed. Each one of them has challenges, hence they've been either on the market or quasi on off the market for the better part of 2 decades now. There is, of course, the lot that is sort of horseshoe shaped that wraps around Dairy Queen on Michigan Ave and Old Creek and Bemis. And then without getting into specifics, I can think of probably 1 to 2 faith communities who have relatively large parcels, large buildings, and in the ensuing decades, they might not have the means to support or maintain those properties. So they may be looking to vacate to a smaller space and sell their parcels, at which time they could be redeveloped.
Right, but there are metrics. We could probably create a development potential map as just a means of interest for the community to see, you know, what parcels hit these 5 different criteria or hit the majority of those criteria and then would potentially be primed for redevelopment for sure.
Ben, do you see in my point of view, there's been an increase in the number of PUDs that have come before the city in the last years of development. Do you see the number of PUDs directly related to a need for a change in our zoning?
Right, so I think it's best practice to see that a lot of variances and a lot of PUDs generally mean that your code is not meeting the needs of people who are actually choosing to build and develop things. So that's definitely a factor, yes. And I also think that PUDs bring into a conversation of fairness because it's not an option available to everybody to pursue a PUD. It's never going to be enforced the same way in 2 different instances because you have different factors that contribute to it. So PUDs have a lot of issues from a regulatory perspective, and then even remembering what those specific criteria that were established with a PUD can oftentimes be difficult. In my previous community, we had PUDs that were 30 years old. None of the original staff that established those PUDs that were intimately familiar with, oh yeah, that's the agreement we came to with setbacks. And although yes, it's documented, sometimes even with paper documents, it's difficult to track down what were those exact agreements. So thankfully here, our PUDs are much newer, so I do have documents on what the agreements were, but I do think it does show a hole in the code of not necessarily being as effective as it could be. And there are always times where PUDs will go above and beyond, and I think that's perfectly appropriate and why that exists. But consistently asking for PUDs definitely alerts me to a larger problem with our code in the community.
And unfortunately for us, some of the lots and the restrictions on the lots, that was the only way
Right.
going to be developed. But to achieve what could be done with those properties, otherwise they would have not been able to be completed that way.
Maple Oaks, I think, is the best example.
Maple Oaks, and then also Maple Cove, Curtis Bluffs, and some of the other ones there. With that, Ben, I think, are you, one more?
One more. I've been watching the news and they're saying that big conglomerates are buying up, you know, like you were saying, single-bedroom condos and having them as rentals or having them as Airbnbs. Maybe somebody wants to come for the, you know, for the summer, which is short, I know, but, you know, do we have something prohibiting that? Do we want that in our city?
You know, so there's pros and cons to it. I can, you know, personally, as someone who's more of a fan of more local ownership of those types of types of things, it's not my personal preference, but the city has no ability to prevent, legally speaking, someone from buying a home and choosing to rent it on their own volition. So it's not something that we have control over. I do think that, yes, like the New York Times and the Washington Post have highlighted those, but most of those homes, if you really look at spatially speaking where they are, they're probably more in like the Detroit suburbs, for example. They're probably more in the Minneapolis area, for example, or we had some in the suburbs. So I do think that it's still likely that we're probably going to have some homes that end up like that, but I don't know if it's necessarily guaranteed, and there's not really much we can do to prevent it, but we can access more housing units and create more supply so more folks aren't in that situation.
Well, and we did realize at our last discussion that approximately 25% of the homes in the city are rentals, and so by adopting the rental inspection program, the idea is to continue to put standards that that home still maintains a better quality and not necessarily fall into a disuse.
Right, and that's 25% of housing units, not 25% of homes. So, for example, like Six Trails has about 300 apartment units there. So 300 units of housing are there. It's about 150 at Thorncrest, about 50 at next door Clark Street. So yes, there are a lot of rental units in that perspective, but when you look at the county, we're actually the lowest in the county. We're below Milan, Dexter, Chelsea. We're below the county average. We're actually below the state percentage of rental homes. Right, they don't usually buy 48. And even Zillow actually got out of the business of doing that because they ended up losing a lot of money. If you're not really present in the local real estate market, buying properties like that ended up being incredibly risky for a lot of those companies.
Okay, Ben, I think that's it. And if you have anything to wrap up, thanks. Thank you all for attending.
Absolutely, I can hang around for more questions, comments, concerns, considerations.
Thank you all.